Thank you for joining the Wisconsin Veterans Museum today for a special curator conversation. We're going to be talking about the Taiwan Straits conflict and what's going on over there. We're going to take just another second here before we get started. We have some people that are still connecting to audio. But as we're waiting for that to happen, I just want to once again thank you everybody for showing up today, taking part of your afternoon, spending it with us. I also want to say thank you to the Wisconsin Veterans Museum Foundation for their continued support in providing this free programming. Not only our curator conversations, but also our book talks, our trivia nights, our movie nights, and all the other virtual events that we do. And I'd also like to say that the Wisconsin Veterans Museum Foundation is able to do this with support in memory of Pat Finley. So we have that to look forward to as well with the foundation support also. Like I said, today we are going to be talking about the Taiwan Straits conflict. We have many people in house today that are going to be chiming in on this. Oh, and sorry, before I move on, I just want to say as well that we do have our security features enabled. So nobody will be able to turn on their cameras or unmute themselves. As always, you can submit any questions that you have for our panel via chat. I will be taking all those questions, putting them into a PowerPoint, and we'll be presenting those at the end of the presentation. But any questions that you have, please submit those to me via chat. And we also have our closed captioning enabled today as well. So if anybody needs to use that service, you are more than welcome to do so. On that note, I am going to turn the presentation over to the museum director, the Wisconsin Veterans Museum director, Mr. Christopher Kolakowski. Chris, the floor is yours, and I'll let you go ahead and introduce the rest of the panel members today and talk a little bit about their background.
Thank you very much, Eric, and thank you all for joining us today. I see some familiar and some not so familiar faces, but it's great to have an audience like this. We've done a couple of these before, where we look at conflicts that are going on today and the historical roots behind them. As you've probably, for those of you who are familiar with our programs and some of what we say, we emphasize the fact that here at the Veterans Museum that the stories that we tell of the Wisconsin veterans still matter. And what may have happened 80, 75 years in the past still has resonance today. And this is one of those that we're going to explore. In addition to that, we also explore topical subjects that perhaps will involve Wisconsin veterans, have involved Wisconsin veterans, or do even today. And one of those that's in the headlines and has been in the headlines of very recent is the conflict between the People's Republic of China and the Republic of China, otherwise known as Taiwan, across the 100 miles or so of water that is the Taiwan Straits. And so what we want to do today is we're not here to advocate for one side or the other, but we are here to try and give some understanding and give you some perspective, both how this conflict came about, how it has evolved over the decades, and what the prospects for the future might be. And so as you look at the events going forward, and as you look at the situation, hopefully it'll increase that understanding. And that's what we're here to do. We've got a great panel today. To do that, of course, I will be part of it, along with my friend and colleague, Jose Custodio, who I've known for a lot of years. Jose is from Manila, although he happens to be in California at the moment. He is a noted defense commentator in the Pacific, has contacts and involvement all over the region, and has also been a defense consultant for the Philippine Department of Defense. So he's a good voice and brings good perspective from somebody from the region for that. I should mention as well that Jose and I are involved in the military history team for the Consortium of Indo-Pacific Researchers, which is a volunteer think tank affiliated with Air University out of Maxwell Air Force Base. And that's because Jose and I work very closely, and this is not quite co-sponsored, but it definitely is a co-production of the military history team and the Wisconsin Veterans Museum. And then, of course, last but definitely not least, is our redoubtable curator of history, Kevin Hampton, which if you've been around any of our programs before, you know he is not that far away and always adds good perspective. And so with that, Kevin, you're going to moderate this discussion, so I'm going to kick it over to you to get us going. And we look forward to a great discussion. And Kevin, take it away.
Wonderful. Thank you, Chris, and welcome everyone. Welcome to our Curator Conversation, or as I like to call it, the Chris and Kevin Show. And as well as if you've been joining us in the past, you'll know we're also known here on staff as the Museum Men with Maps. So be prepared. We've got quite a few maps set up for you today, and I personally have a couple of my favorites. But I do want to just bring into light here in the context of our discussion. Recent news over the last several weeks, actually the last month or more, has brought attention back to a small strip of water, only about 100 miles or so wide, dividing a small island from a major continental power. And it might seem small, it might seem far away and insignificant, but there's definitely some very significant implications with tension in that area. But it's an area of the world that really isn't that unfamiliar to tension. In fact, as you've joined us in our previous programs, you remember that we started these conversations a couple of years ago already with talking actually about the Pacific War and relating that to how does the area and geography affect future conflicts, because really a lot of these flashpoints, if you will, of conflict originate out of the last 75 years, 80 years since World War II. So we're going to talk a little bit about today about the history of the area, how we got to the situation where we're at today, where there's two Chinas, if you will, or in some perspectives, there's two Chinas, and how does it get to that point, and why is it that the United States has such a vested interest over the last 70 years in this area of the world. And then we're also going to talk about how that relates today to the regional experience with our guest today who's joined us, who can speak much more eloquently than I ever could about the region and the area that this affects. So to get us started right out of the bat, because again, Museum Men with Maps, so you got to have a map, right, Chris?
Absolutely.
I want to start with familiarizing ourselves with what we're even talking about in part of the globe. So looking at this map here, obviously you've got the United States, you've got the Pacific. For those of you that joined us for the War in the Pacific discussions, this shouldn't look actually all that unfamiliar because it actually is the same perspective of talking about the island hopping and the chain of events from 41 to 45. But so looking at this map, I just want to point out a couple of key features. Obviously, Hawaii here in between Japan and the United States. You've got Japan up here, just to the north a little bit, and definitely to the east of Korea. So again, perspective here of where the Korean War took place, where obviously a lot of World War II is taking place, is in this general vicinity. And by general vicinity, I mean the entire map. And then, of course, you're looking down here. Here you have Vietnam down here. So familiarizing yourselves there with the conflict of the 1960s and 1970s. Of course, there is a Wisconsin connection or two or three with this little chain of islands right around here, because we've talked about that in the past as well. And I won't say it, but I'll say it, MacArthur. Because I have to throw that in there for Chris.
Well, MacArthur, the Janesville 99, the 32nd Division, there's a lot of Wisconsin. There are a lot of Wisconsin veteran ties to the Philippine Islands.
Definitely. And looking at the names on this map, for those of you that are students of the World War II or interested in World War II, you'll notice some names that look very familiar. The Marshall Islands, Guam. You've got the Philippines, of course. You've got New Guinea and the 32nd Division down here. So there's a lot of history, rich history of military history, especially, and a lot of rich Wisconsin stories that take place in this region over the last 80 years. And of course, 80 years ago. But bringing it to today, let's zoom in a little bit closer, because what we're focusing on today is actually kind of combining our talks. So we've talked about Vietnam in the past. We've talked about the Philippines. We've talked about what happens when the Cold War starts in 45. And so we're actually going to focus right here in the middle. Today, we're going to bring our attention to this zone between the Philippines and Japan and the coast of China. So our second map, bringing us in to give us again perspective of where we're talking, is going to highlight that a little bit more. There we go. So looking here closer, you're going to see the Japanese islands that extend down here towards Taiwan. But this is the stretch of water that we're talking about predominantly, is this area divided between Taiwan and mainland China. So how we get to a conflict over this span of 100 miles roughly, of course less for the islands that are closer because there's small islands right next to it, which we'll zoom in here now, just again give perspective. How we get to a conflict is
this is actually very important. Sorry, Kevin, I'm going to interrupt here and just say, when people talk about the conflict between over Taiwan, never forget a couple of things. This actually outlines the relative positions of the Republic of China and the People's Republic of China, and we'll be using those terms, China for the People's Republic and Taiwan for the Republic of China interchangeably. We'll define those a little bit further. But this is a good current situation map here. You can see Taiwan down to the lower southeastern corner, but it's not just Taiwan that the Republic of China controls. It also controls in the very northern part up there, that is the Tongchen Islands. And then Matsu, you sometimes hear the discussion of Quemoy and Matsu. The Matsu group of islands is up there to the north, and then in the center, if you go down a little bit, Kevin, you see a couple of islands being off the coast of China as well. And then if you go a little bit further to the south and southwest, you'll see Quemoy Island, which sits right off the city of Xiamen in China. It's actually very interesting how you can look out from the city and see the beach defenses of Quemoy Islands. And it was a scene of fighting. We can talk more about that in a little bit, but it was a scene of fighting in 1949 and 1950. And then between there is the Pescadores, or which is the Portuguese name for it. The Chinese name for it is the Penghu Islands, which sit basically at the northern gateway to the South China Sea, which you see to the south. So it's important to keep in mind when you talk about this conflict, it's not just the island of Taiwan that are factors. The Republic of China has more territory than just the island of Taiwan. And of course, at the very northern tip of Taiwan is Taipei, which is the Republic of China's capital.
Excellent. So we want to talk about, because this really has origin, this tension, this conflict, and the subsequent crises, and even the most recent one, all loop back well before even World War II started, with the differences and what we would call the Chinese Civil War, but with the different political parties and also the different fundamental ideas of how to rule mainland China. So I want to bring up this map to kind of spearhead that conversation, which I'm hoping Chris is going to, somehow there's a duplicate image, by the way, but Chris can help us here understand what are we talking about in terms of the two Chinas. So you mentioned that there's two different, People's Republic and the Republic of. So how do we get to that point, Chris?
The story really starts in 1911 with deposing the last Chinese empress, and by the revolution that founds the Republic of China, led by Sun Yat-sen in 1911. As a matter of fact, the date of that revolution, 10th October, known as Double 10, is in fact a national holiday in Taiwan to this day. So the Sun Yat-sen creates a new Republic of China. There's divisions within the government, particularly in the 1920s, particularly after Sun Yat-sen dies a very early death of natural causes. In 1925, and basically very quickly two factions develop that end up splitting. One of them being the communists under Mao Zedong, ultimately under Mao Zedong, and the other one being the nationalists, the Republic of China government forces under the command of Chiang Kai-shek. That's Chiang Kai-shek there to the left, and that's Mao to the right. This is a photograph from them in 1946. They'll actually fight a low-grade civil war in the 1930s, and then pause it when the Japanese invade after the Marco Polo Bridge incident in 1937. And but as one of them admitted to Ernest Hemingway when Hemingway visited in 1941, He said both the communists and the nationalists viewed the Japanese as a skin disease. The heart disease was the Civil War that was going to be fought after the Japanese had been defeated, however long that took. And so the shaded areas you see are the communist base areas at the end of World War II, primarily in the north. And then the white areas, the red areas are where the Japanese held at the end of the war. And then the white areas would be where the nationalists controlled. As soon as the war ends in August of 1945, by January of 1946, nationalist forces under Chiang Kai-shek are operating against the communists, push them back. Although the communists get a lot of support from the Soviets, they launch a series of counterattacks. Their political program works, particularly because of nationalist hyperinflation, misgovernment, and general corruption. And yes, this is a whole presentation in itself. I'm just being very, very quick about it. So bottom line is that the tide, which had originally been seen to be flowing in the nationalist direction, in the Republic of China's direction, turns in 1947 and 48. And by October 1st, 1949, the nationalists are in full retreat. And on October 1st, 1949, Mao in Peking, modern Beijing, proclaims the People's Republic of China. Now, it's important to point out, most people think that's the actual end of the war. It's not. Fighting continues through the winter. Matter of fact, the last nationalist forces don't leave mainland China until May 25th, 1950. And that's something that needs to be kept in mind, is this war lasts right up until 1 month prior to the outbreak of the Korean War. And so there's a lot going on. And as the nationalists are falling back, they're trying to hold offshore outposts on the various islands along the Chinese coast, some of which, like the big one, like Hainan Island, which is just off the map to the south, gets captured by the communists. Some others get captured by the communists, but in the case of the ones that are still held by the Republic of China, by Taiwan today, those were successfully held. Chiang Kai-shek leaves Taiwan and moves the government to Taiwan on November 8th, 1949. And basically, by the summer of 1950, by the outbreak of the Korean War, what's happened is that you have two governments now. You have the People's Republic of China that claims everything, including Taiwan, which was a Chinese province that had been taken away by Japan in 1895, had been given back in 1945. They claim sovereignty over it, plus the mainland. And then you have the Republic of China, which sits on Taiwan at this point, and claims sovereignty over Taiwan and the mainland. And there's never been a peace treaty. There's never really been an armistice. So technically, these two governments, both of which claim to be the overall Chinese government, remain at war with themselves. The Civil War in legally can be argued is still technically going on. So that's how we get to the conflict starting. It really starts with Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalist defeat in 1949, 1950.
I was muted, sorry. I wanted to bring up too that, it's important to remember that since that moment, and I want to bring up this map again, since that, essentially the beginning of the Korean War, really, this area is a very significant portion of the United States foreign policy. And in fact, it'll be really the predominant area for foreign policy over the next 20, 30 years after Taiwan and after the Chiang Kai-shek retreat to Taiwan, because of areas like we talked about before, where you have the Korean War in the early 1950s, and then of course you have the Vietnam War from 1965 through 1975. And so it's almost like there's bookends in this zone. And remember also at the same time that there are now occupation forces post-World War II on the Japanese islands, the islands of Guam, and other places, Okinawa, for instance, as well. So this is a key area, not only for military presence, but also commercially. You're looking at the shipping lanes, you're looking at the bases operating out of the different island groups. So it is a very busy area of the world, if you will, in terms of United States foreign involvement. So it's natural that when there's tension, especially political tension or even outright conflict that we see with the first, the second, and then eventually the third, also Taiwan Straits crisis, you would naturally have Wisconsin, you'd actually have United States involvement because of just its location, if nothing else. Never mind the fact of the political agreements, the alliances, the defense agreements between the United States and the Republic of China. So one thing I do want to bring up just for historical perspective is this image here. And this kind of shows that relationship as it develops between the United States and Taiwan since the very beginning. Now, Chris, could you run us through a little bit what happens, especially in the end of the Korean War, with the first Taiwan Straits crisis and then the second?
So in the mid 50s and the late 50s, the Chinese, the People's Republic, the communists, have made noise about invading across. And actually, the nationalists have said the same thing. As early as 1950, the U.S. 7th Fleet began to patrol the Taiwan Strait, basically to keep the belligerents apart, particularly after the communist Chinese joined the Korean War. They don't want to widen the Korean War and make it a second front. The Chinese do shell several of the islands and do skirmish with some of the offshore islands, 40, 54, 55. And then again in 57, 58 timeframe, right around the time Mao starts the Great Leap Forward on the mainland China. The United States has kind of been lukewarm about Chiang Kai-shek and his ability to hang on, but the fact that it has happened, and also the hardening Cold War, as you think about the overall context of the really increasing division and hardening division of the world into communist East, free West, and then the non-aligned states. Taiwan is seen as a bulwark of against communist aggression in Asia. And so the United States begins to provide more weapons, begins to provide more economic aid, and begins to more openly embrace Taiwan. It should be pointed out, by the way, until 1972, in the famous Nixon trip to China, the United States did not have relations with the People's Republic of China. In fact, that's one of the, if you look at the history of the United States had always had some connection to China since 1784, since the founding of the nation.
Mm-hmm.
From 1949 to 1972, in other words, an entire generation, that was gone. And officially, China's seat in the UN Security Council was held by the Republic of China until 1971, when they withdrew before being kicked out. So this is an overt support to a recognized U.S. ally in 1960. Policy changes in the 1970s, but at this point, the United States and the United States still, to a large degree, is committed to supporting Taiwan.
Mm-hmm.
But at the time, this was the only one of the two players in this conflict that we had diplomatic relations with.
And it's been formalized too. You've got the defense treaty, really, the defense not treaty, the what is it?
You got a mutual defense pact.
Mutual defense pact. Thank you.
Yeah, you've got a mutual defense pact.
Since in 1954. And then you've also got other agreements that were signed. I mean, Carter even had a support resolution, Taiwan Relations Act, that passed the U.S. Congress in '79. So it is something that we've seen throughout the last 30, 40, 50, 60, 70 years, that U.S. support has always been there, whether formal or not. which brings us, because I do want to leave a good amount of time of our conversation today for the current situation. If that's all right with you, Chris?
Absolutely.
Perfect. So I'm going to stop sharing this one. And what I want to do now is actually talk about how all this history of tension, all this previous conflict has led us to what now seems to be potentially the eve of the fourth Taiwan Strait crisis, put by chance. But we also want to talk about the regional implications and the regional effect and how this has an opportunity, or not an opportunity, it has the potential to be a world-changing event, certainly for the people that are there. And so I wanted to do, with that, I want to introduce our guest, Jose. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about your experiences. I know you have also not only been in the Philippines, but in Hong Kong. So can you tell us a little bit about your experience in that region?
Well, I first started like I'm a military historian by training, okay, but eventually I went over to the defense establishment of my country as an analyst there, having worked there for the better part of 2 decades. Okay. But at the same time, I was also doing some history work, just to give it a background for where I'm coming from. You know. That being said, when China relates to the region, we are focused, of course, on the Taiwan Straits issue right now, but at the same time, China has a lot of territorial disputes, okay? One of the more serious ones is where we in the Philippines have I don't even like to call it a dispute because of the fact that the Chinese claim is like totally outrageous, you know, because it doesn't even follow international law. And I'm referring to the South China Sea. Okay, so and the claims over the entire South China Sea issue. Okay? So one thing that I've noticed with China is that it is a very patient country. Okay? It's a very patient entity. Okay, and we had that experience of in the 1990s when the first incident happened between the Philippines and China regarding mischief rift. Okay. You see, that was happening at the same time you had the third Taiwan Straits crisis when you steamed the carriers there. There was also something going on as well in the South China Sea. You know? Which leads me to the feeling that China sees Taiwan as a tough nut to crack. So being very Sun Tzu in a way, you know, like go to the path of least resistance. And the path of least resistance just so happened to be the Philippines. Why? Because at that particular time, we just happened to have kicked out the US bases, you know. Prior to 1995, you know, when all of these big things were happening, you know, the Taiwan Straits crisis, mischief rift, there was a very vigorous reversal of the Philippine-United States relations when in 1991, 1992, the Philippines did not renew the military bases agreement. And that resulted in the loss of Clark and Subic to the United States military. And without any without that type of military agreement between the two countries, the Mutual Defense Treaty was difficult to execute. Why? Because we have a constitutional restriction on the basing of foreign forces or the stationing of foreign forces in the Philippines. You know, because the MBA was the legal cover for that. You know. Because we had the constitutional prohibition to that. Now, so we had that gap, you know, it was like from 1992, 1993, 1994, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So almost the entire decade, there was that gap. And the Chinese exploited that. So because Scarborough Shoal areas that were off limits to the Chinese, precisely because of the presence of the powerful Seventh Fleet, because it was at that time stationed at Subic prior to the us kicking them out. That allowed the Chinese now to move into Mischief Reef, because the Philippine Navy was equipped mostly with World War II vintage warships. I wouldn't even say warships, auxiliary ships actually, which we were, branding as frigates, and things like that, But these were practically just old World War II minesweepers, gun armed. Their heaviest equipment would be a Bofors, a Bofors 40mm Bofors gun, and that would be most likely their heaviest equipment. They might have a 5-incher here or there, but that was about it, more often a 3-inch, and I'm talking about the old 3-inch gun, not even the newer ones. So there, and the Chinese moved in, and I think that was something that, in a way, would in a way link to their effort to establish themselves as a power in this region. At that time, the 1990s, the Quadriennial Defense Review, I remember that the Quadriennial Defense Review at that time was still looking at China as a regional hegemon. It was still looking at it as a regional hegemon, not yet as a global competitor. Okay, and that was like 1995 only, and then late 1990s, and then. Like I said, the Chinese were very serious. They were still one thing you notice about the Chinese is that they will they are triggered by events, they will exploit it, So like, for example, loss of US bases, move into Philippine claimed areas in what we call as the West Philippine Sea. Taiwan States crisis happens, the third Taiwan States crisis happens. Beijing resolves to build up its navy, to face that. Then to make things worse for the United States, Al-Qaeda did the Chinese a service, because when 9/11 happened, because at the time, because I started working for the defense establishment, the Philippine defense establishment, in 1999. And at that time, everybody was still focused on containing the regional hegemon. So I remember the exercises that we were having then were multilateral affairs, where it was at the time, I think the commander of then it was still known as PACOM, Dennis Blair, if I remember his name correctly. He was a very big champion of multilateralism, and of course, we all know it was supposed to contain, it was supposed to contain China's inroads into that region. And at the same time, we were coming up with the Visiting Forces Agreement, which was supposed to be the way to which we would make the Mutual Defense Treaty relevant again. But 9/11 happened. When 9/11 happened, everybody forgot about China. Even the Visiting Forces Agreement, which was supposed to be an instrument to contain China, suddenly became focused on dealing with local terrorists in the Philippines, or local secessionists. Which is an entirely different thing, a different issue, but still linked to that, because everybody started looking inward. Then again, I remember then was that all the multilateral affairs now suddenly had to follow the war on terrorism label, which just made China happy, because of the fact now it could rebuild in peace, it could advance its interests, it could make itself more powerful without having to contend with a US breathing down its neck. So everything that we see right now, with the US steaming into, with the US upping its responses, especially during this time of the visit of Pelosi. I mean, that's like a bit 20 years overdue. So should have happened before, because right now it's like China has built up, but still not as powerful as it, in order to pose a very serious threat, really, to the United States. One thing I can say is that if you're going to link, I mean, if you're going to, let's say, compare, let's say, Japan in the 1930s to China now, the Japanese position was more strategically advantageous to them, whereas China is really, it's all contained. Its forces basically are contained by this chain of islands that start from Japan all the way down to countries that really don't really trust China that much, and whereas Japan in the 1930s, it could actually interdict U.S. naval movements precisely because of that windfall of former German South Pacific possessions, that suddenly went to its lap, but here, so there's hope. It's not as if the sky has fallen yet, okay? And then one other thing that China did was that, despite the fact, okay, that we had this guy Duterte became our president and cost me a lot of white hair, and the loss of hair, actually, I think, is that despite all of his pro-China rhetoric, he couldn't really make a dent in the public perception of distrust to China, although he did really, well, how do I say this? He did really mess with the resolve of Filipinos to defend against China. Now, why am I now? But despite that, China wasn't able to really break the U.S. grip on the Philippines. Its hold on the Philippines. But at the same time, there were also a number of Chinese miscalculations. I think that, like for example, what happened in Hong Kong. When I was in Hong Kong, I have personal stories that I have a sister who lives in Hong Kong, so I keep on going there. At that time when there was still no pandemic. Okay, now it's difficult to go to Hong Kong because you have to quarantine in a 5-star hotel, which is there. No way. So there, no way will I quarantine. Spend like $100 a day. Anyway, the thing is that the Chinese miscalculation on that part, because brought by a heavy-handed approach, because of the feeling of superiority already. I remember talking to some Hong Kong people who were pro-China, okay, that for them, Hong Kong has misbehaved. And anyway, since the adjacent area, which is China, that area is an industrial powerhouse. There's a lot of manufacturing going on in those areas that are beside Hong Kong. They were looking at Hong Kong as something expendable already. Again, I was telling Chris before that the outlook of these people are different from, let's say, an outlook of people who are influenced by Western democratic ideals. The concept of human life can be very, very different, from that. So there was public perception about that. There was perception about that. So there go the heavy-handed approach on Hong Kong. But again, it had an effect also on China's image. Not only in the Philippines but also in Taiwan per se, which is undergoing a transformation in terms of its political. We will see how significant the transformation, but there has been a shift away from the traditional Kuomintang leadership towards other individuals who have been very close to independence for Taiwan persuasions. Okay, so it was like China was, in its effect, it's like it wasn't learning from history, like in its desire to intimidate the Taiwanese, So you had this third Taiwan Strait incident, but in its desire to do that, it became so heavy-handed that eventually, a few years later, you'd have exactly what they didn't want to happen, which was a non-Kuomintang member who had some links with independence groups, and us. One thing I can say is that Taiwan doesn't seem to have. I mean, it's like China. China, by the way, doesn't seem to have time on its side. As the Taiwan issue continues, the more it might become more difficult for unification, precisely because of the fact that a country that exists, the longer it exists, the more national identity it gets, and if that happens, it will be harder for the two countries to these two entities to unite. That's about it before I get flagged for talking too long again. Sorry.
That's actually a very interesting point, Jose. Is you're right. They've lived as effectively two countries.
Mhm.
Depending on where you start that, let's be conservative and start in 1950, but you could almost argue it goes back even into the Civil War period. It's like the two Koreas. I know that's been kicked around as the idea of a possible, if there's ever a unification of the Korean Peninsula, there is a gulf economically, socially, but also in the minds. You saw the same thing with the reunified Germany. And even today, there's still a bit of a hangover. And that's going to be tricky. One question I would have is, you talk about what the Chinese government's doing. How much of this is driven by insecurity on the part of the Communist Party? Particularly with economic prosperity and the recession now, and now the issues they're having with COVID over there. The idea that to distract from, to distract from internal issues, foreign adventure, rattles the net. You know what I'm trying to say.
Yes.
I'm curious how much do you see this as a factor?
Well, it's difficult for me to, let's say, quantify it in terms of what is the percentage of that, But yeah, of course, it's a totalitarian state. Okay, so it is very sensitive when it comes to issues about internal security, especially as they need to, as you have a country that is now undergoing economic problems, other indicators, But again, like I said, sometimes I've heard that before, meaning to say that I've heard people say that China is problematic and it's bound to collapse and blah, blah, blah. But it's like I've heard that 20 years ago. I heard that 10 years ago. So I'm hearing it again now. So it's like, hey, how true is that? There's always the tendency to rebound, from any difficulty that it would have, But the problem, however, is that sometimes a country becomes a victim of its propaganda, and the best current example that we have now is none other than Russia in Ukraine. Okay, that's the best example of a government being a victim of its own propaganda, thinking that Ukraine would be a walkover, and then next thing you know, most likely it's because of the fact that you kept on appointing sycophant generals who wanted just to please you with rosy, wonderful news, So next thing you know is that, okay, go invade, we're okay, we can do this. And next thing you know, they all flounder in the field, So that's the problem also with totalitarian countries, is that the inability to that's the risk, the inability to have some sort of accountability, and some sort of check and balance, and that's a danger. Okay, as compared to previous heads of state of China, this one seems to be a bit more aggressive, So, and then it being a totalitarian state also is that what is the effect of his appointments? How capable are they, etc. And then at the same time, they have also a very aggressive propaganda campaign for their population. At what point would that become untenable? Meaning to say, is that will they become a victim of that propaganda? Will people demand more action? Okay, so but that's something not. I don't see them as becoming like that. Like Russia in the they're a bit more cautious. One thing about the Chinese is even during the height of their extremism, they were still a bit more like look what they did to Vietnam. They bit up a few towns, okay, and then victory, and then they left, something like that. The Russians look very hard-headed, They were, they could have just did the same thing that the Chinese did, but no, they're like continuing and continuing until they're getting beaten up left and right. So now they're faced with a Ukrainian counteroffensive. So that's something that I find them to be a bit more. So yes, it's possible that it's driven by so many factors. One is paranoia. One is, of course, the need to control the population. One is this propaganda that they have. But they're a bit more. They're more. It's like right now I see it's more bombast than the actual willingness to do something about it. Okay. So will they launch a war against Ukraine? Will this happen in our lifetime? In our immediate period now, in this immediate period? If they have any brains, they would just look at what's happening in Ukraine and know that that's two countries that are, joined by land, and Russians still got beaten up. And this one is not just even the English Channel; it's a strait that's 100 miles long, so wide. So the thing is that one thing which I find peculiar is that sometimes people do force matchups of China and Taiwan without taking into consideration is you still have to ship them over 100 miles. so something like that. And I think that's something that goes on with the Chinese military right now. Is that and that's what happened, despite all the fire and brimstone that they said that would happen, and we would punish you severely, fire, blah blah blah. And next thing you know is that's it. So, but wait 20 years from now.
And you see that with the escalations. You'd mentioned that where, even from the 1990 exercise areas to comparative to what happened in the last month. I'm just going to show this quick map here. You see that, it's taking time, but they're encroaching closer and closer. That gradual literally test the waters, and then see how close you can get.
If I can add something, I remember, and this is linked to the claims, their claims in the South China Sea, West Philippine Sea area. Okay, I am obligated to say West Philippine Sea area because Filipino there. It's Philippine pride. Anyway, so in the South China Sea area, is that in the latter part of the first decade of the 21st century, they were already saying that. They were saying, we're going to defend our interests. They kept on saying that we will defend our interests, even though they didn't have the capability yet, because at the time we were arresting their fishermen left and right. We even had one Filipino captain of a World War II vessel ram a Chinese fishing vessel that was poaching in our waters, which resulted in a Chinese frigate, modern Chinese frigate, try to run after him. And by that time, the boat that could had run away ready. But the thing is that that after this series of warnings, China was beginning to introduce one maritime vessel after the other. Okay, so they warned, they built, they executed. So in 2012, they hit us with the Scarborough standoff, when a Philippine vessel tried to accost Chinese vessels, and then suddenly it was swarmed upon by Chinese maritime vessels. So it took them almost 10 years to execute that. Starting from when they started intimidating us in 1994. Then by 2012, we're able now to stop us from arresting their fishermen, and now they're the ones harassing our fishermen. Now it's gone full circle.
Yeah, the conflicts and the confusion of, and I guess not confusion necessarily, but just the overlaying claims to the South China Sea area is remarkable. I mean, you're looking at a highly trafficked economic zone. If I recall correctly, I think it's like 10 or so million barrels of oil, I think, flow through the South China Sea daily. Actually, here, I think I have a map about it, because of course I have a map. Why wouldn't I have a map?
Maps are the meaning of life.
There we go. Exactly. See, Chris, I like him. So I just want to point out that, you know, this is why there's so much tension, is where all this comes from.
That's
It's
11 million barrels a day for those of you scoring at home that pass through the South China Sea.
Yep, right there. So it's not just, you know, pride and whatever. There's an economic factor to it as well. I know we're oh, I'm sorry, Jose, you want to say something?
No, it's okay. It's okay.
I know we're getting a little close to time here, but I do want to have time for questions. So I was hoping we could wrap up with any final statements or comments about what currently has happened in the last 3 weeks and what the future might bring. I know you've alluded to that, Jose, of it's not necessarily the crisis now. What does it look like in 20 years kind of thing. But I do want to give an opportunity for both you and Chris to say any final remarks, if you will.
Jose, I'll let you go first.
Okay. One thing is that China does not move, you know, by experience that we've had in bilaterals with them, that some of which I have attended, is that they have a lot of, use the term, tentacles. Okay, they have a lot of tentacles and a lot of pincers, if you use another military term, and their approaches are not purely military. Okay, we can get so focused on the military and forget that they also have other means to enforce their will. You know, and if you look at Taiwan, yeah, despite the rhetoric and all of the rhetoric, there are still a lot of links between the two. Okay, and like I said, China is a very, very patient. Beijing is a very, very patient player in this type of time. In the case of the Philippines, the same also. And I think if you want to see how China operates, look at how China operates in the Philippines. You know, yeah, we're all the United States is so happy now because it's hearing the wonderful things about the Philippines being part of this stronger response militarily to Chinese aggression in the South China Sea. But at the same time, or the statement that the Philippines might be a base of operations if there's ever a conflict in Taiwan. So it's like music to the ears of Washington, and so very, very happy. But at the same time, the Philippines is also allowing the Chinese to establish influence in certain areas, you know, like entering our strategic industries, and so forth, you know, setting up gambling networks in the Philippines, you know, which then influence the local governments, the mayors, the governors, you know, things like that. And that's also something that the Chinese are doing, and they do it very, very effectively because they are not tied by the niceties of American governance, which is accountability. They don't have accountability. They just go straight and you know do things that they're, and the Americans are always like, oh, we have to see if this doing is right. No, we can do this, we can do that, you know. So in that sense, at the end of the day, that's the challenge for the United States, you know. It's not just the military aspect, it's also how the China manages to co-opt the governments per se, you know. So the Duterte was the best example, that you had the Philippines, a major ally in this part of the world, in the United States, but at the same time having a president who was mouthing off pro-China statements left and right.
And actually, that's a real good segue into what I was going to say, is this conflict is not going anywhere. It's a long-term thing. China is playing a long game. Both sides are playing a long game, actually, both the Taiwanese and the People's Republic. A couple of things I think that we see, if you look just down the road, that may have a huge influence on how this long game, how things go over the next, say, 8, 10, 12, 20 years, is actually the third part, the Party Congress that's coming up in Beijing in October, where Xi Jinping is up for a third and unlimited term, which would put him, and if it goes the way that people are predicting, it will cement him as a leader of communist China on the stature of Mao or Deng Xiaoping. It'll put him in that level, and it'll probably elevate him closer to Mao than to Deng Xiaoping. And it will also solidify Chinese leadership and strategic direction and structure, which you've talked about, Jose, for the foreseeable future. And so that is to me, the next big milestone and the big indicator of what this whole situation, which ways the winds may be blowing as we go forward in the next few years in the South China Sea and the Taiwan Strait. And so with that, Kevin, I'll throw it back to you.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you, Jose. And I want to point out just two last things before we shift to questions. Is that here in the United States, especially in Wisconsin, the center of the country and the continent, really. Not that everything revolves around us, but you know what I mean. You think about the idea that these escalating tensions, we're very safe here. We don't have, Canada shooting missiles over the top of Milwaukee, over Milwaukee skies and landing somewhere behind us, or south of us, versus this is almost a daily reality for certain areas of the world. And especially obviously like we talked about with Europe today since February. But why this most recent activity is so concerning, or at least we should consider, if you're looking here at, this is even the projected directions of where the missiles landed in the last exercises. And you can see no longer are these zones of these live fire areas more closer to the Chinese coast than the Taiwanese coast. Now they're even just going right over the island. And you have that reality, that possibility. And again, we see that with the headlines out of Korea every once in a while as well, or especially in Japan too, with those events as they transpire. And then I'll point out one last map here that I think is really interesting, is again to show how this seems to be expanding and being a little bit more aggressive than the last time. You're starting to see drones playing a component into this whole situation. And if you'll notice, not only is it just contained to surrounding where these exercise areas were identified, now you actually have that military presence passing fairly close to Okinawa, which still has a substantial impact for our military personnel that are stationed there. Because if you think about it, there are a decent number of people from the United States military, either the Navy or Marines, stationed not that far away from where all this is happening. So always keep that in mind as well. We may not have that same significant presence as we did in the Philippines, just to the south here, as we did, as we used to since then with the previous crises. Now it's also a concern for the Japanese as well. So with that, I want to open it up to questions. Eric, any chance you can jump in here for those?
Sure. Yeah, we got lots of good questions. Let me go ahead and share my screen real quick and bring these questions up. The first question that we had, could you say something about Mao's Long March and how it led to long-term effects in this conflict?
I would actually argue the Long March, which is an epic of evacuation of the communist forces in 1934 and 35, actually, without it, nothing else happens. Because the Long March does two things. Number one, by moving from the coast up into the north central highlands, which is much less accessible for Chiang's forces, the communists are able to evacuate to safer ground, regroup, and then rebuild their strength to the strength they were in when World War II started, we were talking about. The other thing it does is it solidifies Mao's leadership over the Communist Party. And it is a leadership that once he assumes it during the Long March, once he assumes that supreme leadership, he won't give up until his death in 1976. And here's the map. Here's the map of it here, moving from the coast in Guangdong province and moving up into Yan'an, which is where they'll be all through World War II. And it will be their base of operations for a good part of the next decade, if not the next 15 years until the Civil War is won.
Next question, gentlemen. What is Taiwan's trade status with the U.S. currently?
But the thing I read about this is the fact that much of the microchips manufacturing, is done in Taiwan. And that's what that simple fact that it has a very significant effect on the United States, being a industrialized, technologically advanced country that it is. I speak in terms of being coming from a third world country. Anyway, so that being said, the fact that a primary cog in the United States technological position is supplied by a country that isn't a country according to, let's say, the United Nations or whatever, and at the same time is right smack beside a country that is hostile to it, puts in jeopardy that particular aspect. So that particular supply of microchip. So I think that's what I read somewhere that President Biden is passed a law or something that or signed a law that would build the capacity of the United States to do such a thing. Yes, of course, Taiwan doesn't rank in the same vein as China has in terms of trade relations, but it occupies a very, 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 very significant niche. Okay, a niche that has actually national security implications, because the United States has also to ensure that that Taiwan stays within its ambit, because the problem in that part of the world, is that I actually belong to that part of the world. I've been here in California for several months that I'm thinking that that part is not anyway. Is that sometimes political changes, tend to swing a policy, a national policy, and that's why the Chinese are trying to win over the Taiwanese. The things that they've been also trying to do, they try to do in the Philippines and they try to do in Malaysia. Okay, so it's that thing. Okay, if they can swing it, then that goes now to Beijing may suddenly reap the benefits of that. But I'm not an economist. I'm a historian.
Well, I also know that they announced there's trade negotiations rekindled now since June, I think, between Washington and Taipei.
Yeah.
Next question, gentlemen. Does the U.S. still agree with or abide by the one China principle that was set forth by President Bush in 1982?
The absolute shortest answer to this question is yes.
Yes.
That was a short answer. Very good.
It was, yes.
Well, I know we got more questions. I'm trying to be efficient here, Eric.
And the next question: why was Nancy Pelosi's recent visit to Taiwan such a big deal? Why did that make such big headlines?
Well, for starters, basically, is that it's her position in the United States government. What's her position? She's like, so Speaker of the House. Sorry, I'm Filipino, so in terms of fourth, right? Third. She's number 3. Okay, right. And that's like practically something that the Chinese, that Beijing would see as a threat, and it's also a morale booster for the Taiwanese to get such a very, very prominent American official, the third highest ranking American official to visit Taiwan, specifically not for tourism.
This relates back to the previous question because it becomes a tacit acknowledgement. Mm-hmm. She's the senior most U.S. government official to be there in a long time, certainly since Taiwan lost its recognition by the United States. But the other thing, and I think this is interesting in coverage, is you talked earlier about the differing mentality among people on the mainland and in that part of the region. With separation of powers, the 3 branches of government, the third person in the executive branch under the president actually is the Secretary of State.
Yeah.
But the perception out there, because the Speaker of the House is third in line to succession, is that she would be the equivalent of, say, Xi Jinping's not deputy, but the deputy's deputy.
Yeah.
And that perception and that matters a lot. as to how they view it. And it's watching the media coverage, and, it was viewed very differently. Her position relative to the President of the United States was viewed very differently in the region than it was here in Washington.
I would also say that it was, look at the timing of it too. You're going off of a global message that everyone's heard, that the conflict in Ukraine is, at least according to the Russian perspective or Putin's perspective, the conflict in Ukraine is strictly Western created, and how they're causing the problem. This was a defensive action by Putin. Look at that now after 6 months of pounding that drum of what that means for Taiwan and China, and how the United States, you could potentially change that messaging to, well, the United States is causing this tension again. And so there is always that element. You have to think about, what is the messaging, what is happening around it? Like Jose mentioned, how is China using those events to not manipulate, but to maybe manipulate, to command the messaging, I guess I would say.
And just on a personal note, I'm wondering, especially Jose, maybe you can answer this. China's reaction to Speaker Pelosi being in Taiwan seemed a little, I guess, underwhelming. Would that be a good way to generalize their reaction to her visit?
Well, they did a lot of noise, right? Of course, and they were saying that this would happen and that would happen, but in the end, everybody was of the, when I say everybody, I'm talking about those who from the defense sectors and national security sectors. They knew that this would be basically rhetoric, But like I was saying, that China uses this to increase its capabilities, to improve on its capabilities. This become pivotal events in world history, such as, like, for example, the third Taiwan Strait crisis was a pivotal event in a way. It sort of like humiliated China, that the steaming of the US battle groups through the Taiwan Strait, and the China not being able to do anything about it. So the effect of this is we will see in the future. Okay, what will China do? And then following Pelosi, there's something. There was an announcement, I think, of selling more weapons to Taiwan.
Yes, that's
so
correct.
Those things will now make China realize that something again has to be done. But I would also say that China's although China's a lot of time, China's also sort of running out of time also. Like I said, that the example of Ukraine is a lesson to be learned in trying to force your will on another country. They see what happened, how an aggressor was treated. They see the international support that Ukraine is getting. They see that that the Ukrainians were able to hold off and then now launch a counteroffensive. So what I'm saying here is that that China would think twice, really, in what it could do. Would it really want to push for a war, or would it try to find other ways to merge with Taiwan, hoping the United States gets eaten up by its own problems in the next decades? Of course, it does look at what the politics are here in this country also.
And maybe this one goes to Jose as well, but I'm sure Chris will have some input on this. What do you guys think that the most misunderstood piece of the Taiwan issue is?
For me, basically, it's this underestimating Taiwan. For me, basically, it's underestimating Taiwan.
I would agree with that. Taiwan is a very difficult nut to crack, and there's a lot of people that don't understand the geography. And as Jose alluded to in his remarks earlier, don't understand the logistics of just getting an army across 100 miles of contested water, to say nothing of taking the other islands as well. And so the geography, underestimating the Taiwanese position and the assets that they have, I completely agree with Jose.
That's where the Philippines comes in,
Yep, that's right.
a weaker country.
And kind of piggybacking off that, does Taiwan have the ability, really have the ability to defend itself from a Chinese incursion?
I would say yes. I would say yes. They've got several assets. First of all, that 100 miles that we talked about. Those outpost islands, at one point during one of the crises, Chiang Kai-shek put 100,000 troops on those outpost islands that we showed at the very beginning. So they can hold a lot of troops and they're heavily fortified. So they are not easy nuts to crack. And then Taiwan itself, if you look at the topographic of it, it's mountainous to the east. There's a plain to the west, but the plain is very much broken up with rice paddies. There was actually the Americans, when they studied this island back in 1944 and looked at the possibility of an invasion, they realized they'd have to take a port very quickly, and the geography would not support an attack of more than basically a couple of divisions of of Americans before you got into the mountains, which favor the defender. And thank you for bringing this back up. Yeah, you can see the mountains and then the green there, the plain. So the island itself is very difficult. There's a reason the United States didn't invade it and chose to invade elsewhere, Okinawa and the Philippines to be precise. But there's a lot of terrain advantages, and the Taiwanese military is highly capable, and they have thought a long time about how to defend this island. And I mean, it would be a nasty fight, and I would put my money on the Taiwanese to at least be able to hold the island.
And give its international partners, because of the fact of the lack of an American-Taiwanese alliance, formal treaty. So I would say partners, the time to come in and support their forces. So it's like, yeah, China has millions of men under arms, okay, but it can only ship a tiny fraction of that across 100 miles of water where its invasion fleet will be prone to interdiction from all of these islands there. So yeah, it's going to be a lot of losses, horrendous losses suffered by the Chinese. It will be a repeat of it won't be like a Normandy for them, because of the fact that even the United States Navy in World War II, with its plethora of amphibious capabilities, still didn't proceed, as Chris said, with the invasion of Taiwan. And they picked a nicer country, again, the Philippines. So there's history repeats itself. Now it's a Chinese targeting the Philippines because it's easier to crack. So there.
All right, gentlemen, we are just about out of time, so we're going to go ahead and close this out. But Jose, we'd like to really thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
Chris, Kevin, as always, you guys do a fantastic job. This has been really informative, really kind of eye-opening, and it certainly highlights how complex this situation is and can become, most certainly. We'd like to thank everybody. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Kevin.
I was gonna say, I'll throw one last thing, and we've been talking about that 100-mile distance. For those that are here in Wisconsin, imagine that the distance as the crow flies between here and La Crosse is that same distance. So whether it's from an invasion or passing ships through, that's the distance we're talking about.
Which does put it in perspective, absolutely. Like I said, I'd like to thank everybody for showing up today and for joining us for this wonderful talk. I'd like to remind everybody that the next talk that we have coming up is going to be a book talk, and that'll be on September 19th. And that'll be with Dr. Michael Hankins, who is with the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum. And he's going to be talking about his newest book called Flying Camelot, the F-15 and F-16, and the weaponization of fighter pilot nostalgia. That'll be the same bat time, same bat channel. In just a week from this coming Monday. So we hope to see many of you join us for that book talk. And in the meantime, I hope everybody has a great weekend. And if you're in Madison, get out and see the Ironman competition going on. And if you're not in Madison, well, I hope you have some good stuff lined up for your weekend. Kevin, Chris, Jose, thank you again for joining us
Thank you.
today. And we'll see everybody next time.